Getting your head around the RC600 parameter guide can be a difficult task, so I've put together a playlist of videos running through each page step by step. In the first 4 videos I talk through the memory settings, which you'll find by pressing the loop button, but today we're starting to run through the system settings, which you can access under the menu button. So let's get to it. Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. As mentioned in the intro, we're starting to run through the system settings, which you can access from page 9 of the parameter guide. And in this first video, we'll look at the input options featured on pages 9 and 10. Now, if you haven't already checked out other videos in this series, do click up here to navigate to other areas that might be of interest. And if you are new here, do consider subscribing to stay in the loop. And as always, if you find it valuable, please give it a like so it can reach more and more people like your good self. Also, thank you to everyone who supported the channel in some way, gave a super thanks, bought me a coffee, etc. It's greatly appreciated, and you can now show your appreciation by supporting the channel at the links below. I'm always in need of a coffee, actually, especially with a 2-year-old running about, so thank you very much for all of the coffees that have been bought recently. Anyway, if we press the menu button right here, we're going to go into some new settings that we haven't covered in previous videos on the parameter guide. So I'm going to press the menu button as such, and we've got a few options here to delve into further. And as mentioned, we're going to look at the options under input in this video. So everything that I'll talk about today are going to be under this first button. So we're going to push this knob down, and now we've got 3 options here. We've got setup, we've got EQ, and we've got dynamics. If we press the setup button, we're going to go into our input options for setup, and you can see first of all we've got phantom power for the microphones, which are mic 1 and 2 phantom, and you can see it's switched off by default. Now, phantom power is basically an option that we can use to turn on or off depending on what kind of microphone we're using. So if we're using a condenser microphone, you are likely to need your phantom power turned on in order for that microphone to work properly. If you're using a dynamic microphone, then you're going to have that phantom power switched to the off position. So next to phantom power, I've got instrument gain, and you can see I've got one for instrument 1 and one for instrument 2. So this gives us the option to adjust the gain for the devices that we've got connected to the instruments 1 and 2. Basically, if you're using an instrument such as a guitar, a bass, a keyboard, etc., you will want to make sure that you've got the instrument selected for each of these. However, if you're running any audio equipment into these inputs, like any line level equipment, you're going to want to make sure that it's switched to line. If I page across, you will see I now have some options for stereo link under mic, instrument 1 and instrument 2. So this basically gives us the option to split our instrument signal into 2 inputs. So when stereo link is on for the instruments, you will see the same settings will be used for the left and right jacks. However, when you turn this off, what will happen is that will split, where are we? There we go. That will split our signal into 2 mono inputs for each instrument. So obviously I've done this for instrument 1, I can do it also for instrument 2, and now I can basically use each of my instrument inputs at the back of the RC600 as mono, as opposed to having it stereo. By default, stereo link is on for the instrument inputs and off for the mic input. So when the mic stereo link is switched on, what that means is the both mics 1 and 2 will have the exact same settings. So having that off just means that you can have different settings for both mic 1 and 2 inputs. And finally, I'm going to page across one more time, and I've got preference. So this allows us to choose whether or not we want our mic and instrument settings to be applied across all 99 memories, or just to be applied to the selected memory. In this case, I believe I'm on memory 51. So any settings that I make, if I go back to my input and then into setup where I was before, page across. So any settings I make to my input settings here, stereo link settings, these are all going to be just applied to memory. As you can see, I've got mic selected to memory, instrument 1 and instrument 2 all selected to memory. So I tend to use a number of different templates and then save everything to the memory rather than system. This way I can just make fine adjustments if needed and have slightly different settings depending on my setup. So if you save it to system, then all of your settings will be saved across the entire system, and then you'll be unable to make those small changes unless of course you revert back to changing or saving to memory. Basically, it's going to depend on whether or not you want to keep everything the same across all of your memories. But if you do like to have more control, I'd consider saving to memory and creating a few templates that you frequently use, and writing these templates to new memories when you want to use them for one of your other songs. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to exit out of that one time. There was my setup where I went into before, and now we're going to delve into EQ. So next up we've got the EQ option, and you can see I've got mic 1, mic 2, instrument 1 and instrument 2. So I can make EQ adjustments for all of my 4 inputs. Obviously if stereo link was switched off, then I would have instrument 1L, instrument 1R, instrument 2L, instrument 2R. So I'd have more options for EQing each of the inputs at the back. But now we're just going to talk about the basics. If I just go into 1, we'll just talk about the basics of the EQ settings. Now, EQ is always a personal preference, and it's going to depend on a number of factors, including your desired sound, so what sound you want to achieve, what equipment you're using, the room that you're performing in, etc. But I do want to talk you through a very simple approach on how to understand the EQ options in the RC600, and in particular parametric EQ, which basically allows us to cut and boost in certain areas of the frequency spectrum. Now, before I go through these settings, I like to think of EQ in a couple of ways, which are, do I like this particular sound or don't I? If I do, I might want to consider boosting in a certain area, and if I don't, and I'll probably likely want to remove this from my overall sound. So the descriptors I like to use when I want to add something to my mix are, for the low end, I think of bass. For the low mids, I think of warmth. For the high mids, I'm going to think of clarity. So do I want to add some more clarity? Then I'll be using these particular parameters in my EQ settings. And then if I just go back a couple of pages, you can see I've got high gain here, and then right at the top I've got my high cut and low cut. And if I want to add something at the top end, then I'm going to think of presence. Now, you might also find problem frequencies on your instruments or when you're recording. So this can obviously be applied before, so at the input stage, or even at the output stage of your EQ, when you're EQing your outputs as well. So the terminology I like to use for the low end would be rumble. So I might think this particular sound isn't too great, so why is it not too great? Is it the fact that there is some rumble at the bottom end? For the low mids, it might be quite boxy or quite muddy. For the high mids, it might be quite a harsh sound that I'm getting. And then for the high end, like we did before, we've got the high gain there, and then we've got the high cut at the top. So that might be the fizz sound that you might be getting, which is also quite a harsh sound. So running down the list on page 9 of the parameter guide, you will first see the option for a switch. So obviously SW here on the left hand side will decide whether or not we want our EQ turned on or turned off for the specific input we've decided. So in this case we're on mic 1. So do I want any EQ being applied to mic 1? First of all, I will turn it on. Next to that we've got low gain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through things as simply as possible. I know that a lot of us probably understand a few of these settings anyway, but let's just go over things as if we're all complete beginners. So the low gain is basically going to allow us to cut or boost the low frequencies. So we can use this control here to decide whether we want to go up or down, and it goes from minus 20 dB to plus 20 dB. And obviously right in the middle is 0, where it is by default. High gain is right next door, so that is exactly the same. That will go up or down, plus or minus 20 dB. And that's going to cut or boost in the high frequency range. Now, the Q setting here, the Q option allows us to be a bit more precise and gets us to adjust the width of the area that we want to affect. So the higher the number of Q, so at the moment we've got 0.5, it's very low. If we go all the way up to 16, what that means is it's going to be a really narrow area that we are affecting with our frequency range. So let's say we find something at around about 500 Hertz that we really don't like the sound of, and we know it's 500 Hertz, then we can afford to adjust our Q very narrow so that we know that when we want to drop that, if we want to cut that completely out, then we know we've cut something. Oh, sorry, I should have really adjusted that to 500. Let's go 500 Hertz. So now 500 Hertz has been cut from our overall sound. However, if you're not quite sure where that problem frequency is, you might want to keep your Q relatively low, just so that the sound itself, see if I can get my hand on here, is more like this that you're affecting rather than a really narrow area. And this is how my hand will do narrow as opposed to not so narrow. So if I page across one more time, I've now entered the options for high mid, which are the same as low mid. However, I'm going to be affecting the high mids on our frequency spectrum. And one more page across, I've got my final three options here, which are level. This is going to adjust the overall level of the EQ that I want to apply to this particular input. And next to that, I've got my low cut and high cut, which are both set to flat by default. So the high cut and low cut are filters, basically allowing us to remove all of the low or the high frequencies, and we can choose where we want those low or high frequencies to be removed from on our frequency spectrum. And they are both set to flat by default, which means that the low and high cut filter will have no effect whatsoever. So I tend to start with the low cut, and then I'll use my low gain to control and cut or boost that particular frequency. And then I'll do the same with the high cut and the high gain. What I'll do then is I'll move on to the low mid, and then finally the high mid. Now sometimes I might be happy with a certain sound and only need to make small adjustments or adjustments only in certain areas. But that's how I tend to do things, and we all approach these things differently, but that's EQ. Okay, so I'm going to exit out of that, and you can see finally I've got my option for dynamics. You'll find these on page 10 of the parameter guide, and here we can control the level of the compressor and noise suppressor, which is applied to the audio input for all of our microphones and instruments. So if I just press dynamics, you can see I've got mic 1 here, mic 2 here, page across, instrument 1 and instrument 2. So mics 1 and 2 both have an option for a compressor and a noise suppressor, indicated by the comp and the NS options here. So by default the compressor is off. However, we do have a range from 1 all the way up to 100. So you can add however much of the compressor effect you want to your microphones. And then NS, the noise suppressor, is on 40 by default, and that goes all the way from 0 if you want it completely off, up to 100 as well. So in a nutshell, the compressor is going to reduce the dynamic range and allows you to narrow down the difference between the loudest and the softest parts of your overall sound. And the noise suppressor will eliminate any unwanted noise without affecting the natural tone of your microphone or instrument. Anyway, folks, that's it for today. Sorry if it got too technical in areas, but I did want to go over things in a little more detail, especially when it comes to EQ. It's a very difficult thing to get right, but certainly getting your head around what each of these parameters do is a good starting point. So next up in the series, I'm going to focus on the output settings on pages 11, 12 and 13 of the parameter guide. So do stay tuned for that one. If there is anything else you'd like to check out or you think you might have missed, then please click the playlist on screen to check out other videos in the series. And as always, if you found it useful, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel to stay in the loop. And you can support the channel through the various links below. And as always, everybody, I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta!